I spent 20 years taking care of my second husband, doing the laundry, cooking his meals, escorting him to doctor appointments, staying by his side through every hospital stay, believing it was simply what a wife should do. Until that day when I overheard him in the hospital corridor telling another patient, "She's nothing but a free caregiver. Of course the money goes to my son once I'm gone." That was when I realized I hadn't been protecting a marriage. I had been trapped in a con. And now I was going to show them what a real reckoning looked like. I sat in that creaky folding chair beside his hospital bed, the coffee in my hand long cold, though I was still gripping the cup without realizing it. Richard lay under the covers, hooked up to N4, mumbling softly in his sleep. I had lost count of how many times he'd been admitted to the hospital, but something about this visit made him feel like a stranger to me. The doctor said it was a minor stroke. Thankfully we got him here quickly enough. There would be no permanent damage. But the stroke had changed him in other ways. He leaned on me more. I was wiping his face, helping him turn in bed, feeding him spoonful by spoonful. Every 2 hours I was up adjusting his position. Even with my aching back, I massaged his legs to keep circulation going. The nurses kept calling me a wonderful wife, saying women like me were rare nowadays. I would smile and say nothing. I'd heard that line too many times. So many times, in fact, that it no longer registered. Just like the routines of our life together. Duties I had long stopped questioning, even if I no longer remembered what I'd given up to fulfill them. At night, the hospital didn't allow visitors to stay over, so I'd return at dawn. The nurses' station lights were still on when I arrived that morning. A young man was flipping through the changeover charts. I walked in carrying coffee and a paper bag of breakfast. The hall reeked of disinfectant, sharp enough to sting my nose. I set the bag down beside his bed, oatmeal muffins, his favorite, still warm from the oven. But the bed was empty. "Your husband's down in the courtyard getting some fresh air," a nurse called out with a nod. Said he needed it. I thanked her and headed toward the courtyard. At that hour the sun had just risen, and the light filtering in made the space feel calm. I figured I'd push him around for a little walk. That thought warmed me slightly and I picked up my pace, until I rounded the corner and heard his voice. He was sitting in his wheelchair, chatting animatedly with the guy from the next bed over, a man a few decades younger. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop. I'd simply frozen in place. Because the voice coming out of Richard's mouth didn't sound like the man I had cared for all these years. He was speaking with that smug buddy-to-buddy tone, half boasting, half sneering. "Tell me I'm not the smartest guy alive," he chuckled. "I'm in my 60s and landed a younger woman to marry me. Doesn't cost me a dime, she does everything. Cooking, cleaning, hospital runs. Rachel jumps at the chance to handle it all." He gave a lazy laugh, dragging out the words. "A free livin' made man. That's what I call good luck." I stood there, my shoes glued to the icy tile floor, completely paralyzed. His voice wasn't loud, but every syllable pounded into my eardrums like a hammer. "She thinks we have a great relationship," he continued. "But I've had my plans in place. When I die, the money's going to my own blood. Dylan may be a screw-up, but he's still my son. As for Rachel, she can go back to her daughter's place and live out her golden years. Won't be my problem." The other man gave a short, amused laugh. In that moment, it felt like something inside me turned over and twisted violently. My stomach roiled. My eyes burned. But I couldn't cry. I couldn't let him know I had heard. I took a step back, light and quiet like a ghost, then darted around the corner. A gurney wheeled past with a shriek of rubber against linoleum, the sound slicing through my chest like a blade. I leaned against the wall, eyes closed, trying to steady my breath, to force down the rising flood of hurt and humiliation. All these years I thought I was part of something, important to someone, that in his final chapters we'd be each other's safe harbor. But no. To him I was just convenient, just useful. And what cut deepest was this: I had truly given it my all. I never saw him as a burden. I cared because I wanted to, because it felt right, even when my spine throbbed from strain, even when his son never once acknowledged me as family. I never complained. I gave, and gave, and gave. But now I knew, my kindness, my sacrifices had only fed his ego. I was nothing more than a pawn in his story. A thing he could brag about. When I returned to the room, Richard was back in bed. He looked up and smiled. "Did you get the muffins? You shouldn't tire yourself out, you know." "I was just telling the guy downstairs. You're the one person I can always count on. I looked at him, my lips twitching into something that wasn't quite a smile. That line, the one I can count on, in his mind, probably meant, the one that's most obedient. I said nothing. But in my heart I etched the moment in stone. Not because I was broken, but because I was finally awake. And I was still alive. Which meant I still had a choice. When I got home from the hospital, I didn't turn on the lights all day. It was one of those rare sunny afternoons in California, but the house felt as cold as a basement. I sat curled up on the couch, arms wrapped around myself, unmoving, like I was straining to hear a voice from long ago, trying to pinpoint the year I started letting myself disappear. This house was never my choice. Never something I loved. It used to belong to Richard and his first wife. When we got married, he refused to move. He said, "Dylan's used to this place. A new house would be too much for him." Dylan was already 15, taller than me, constantly rolling his eyes. He never once called me mom, and even saying Rachel sounded forced. But I said yes anyway. I moved in with 2 boxes of books, 1 cooking pot and a cat, into someone else's past. I thought that if I was kind enough, patient enough, I might be accepted. I spent 3 months redoing the kitchen, scrubbing grease stains off the walls with lemon water bit by bit. Back then I was still working at the library. Every evening after work I'd pick up groceries and cook meals I knew they liked. I remember our first Thanksgiving. I spent 2 nights learning how to roast a turkey from scratch. 5 minutes after I set it on the table, Dylan, scrolling through his phone, said, "This gravy's weird. My mom's always tasted better." I didn't say a word. Just quietly cleared the plates. Back then I still believed that patience could win hearts. Looking back, that was the first time I became invisible. The first time I realized this house wasn't mine, and never would be. I stayed by Richard's side through a career layoff. I handled every legal form and signature after his ex-wife passed away from cancer. He sobbed her name and I just poured him tea, never once complaining. When Dylan dropped out of college, I dipped into my own retirement savings to cover his credit card debt, just so Richard could rest a little easier. I tried so hard to become part of this family. Pretended to like golf. Pretended to understand their disdain for new neighbors. Pretended not to notice when they forgot to introduce me at family gatherings. Once at his niece's wedding, Richard introduced me as, "This is Rachel, a friend of the family." I held my wine glass like a borrowed extra, grinning through a script where my character had no name. That night I sat in the garage alone, crying for half an hour. Then I dried my face and made dinner like nothing happened. I used to think that was what marriage looked like. Compromise. Mature love. A quiet kind of grace. We weren't young anymore. Getting remarried came with baggage. I told myself I didn't need romance or rituals or declarations. Just someone to grow old with. Someone to lean on. But now I know. That wasn't partnership. That was exploitation. The moment I heard Richard call me a free maid. Every ounce of tolerance, every time I swallowed my pride, every compromise I made, collapsed like wooden beams under a sudden weight. And I had to ask myself, all these years, who was really being taken care of? Who was really doing the sacrificing? As I sat there lost in thought, the doorbell rang. I wiped the tears off my cheeks, tried to look composed, and opened the door. It was Dylan. He was wearing a faded hoodie, hands shoved into the pockets. The second he stepped inside, the smell hit me, cigarettes and laundry detergent. Without a glance in my direction, he walked straight to the kitchen and opened the fridge. "Where's Dad?" he asked while rummaging around. "Doctor said it wasn't serious, right? He told me to stop by and grab a few things." I kept my voice steady. "He's still at the hospital. If you've got time, maybe go see him." He shrugged, clearly uninterested. Then he pulled out a Coke and casually said, "I told him to get that all sorted soon. No point in leaving a mess later." My knuckles turned white. He plopped down at the dining table, sipping from his straw with a lazy smirk. "Don't take it personally. It's not like this house is yours anyway." I didn't respond. But in that instant I heard a door slam shut deep inside me. I was done. Done trying to win him over. Done pretending to be a good stepmother. Done clinging to the fantasy that one day this house might become my home. It never was. It was never meant to be. I reached over and quietly flipped off the kitchen light, leaving only a warm amber lamp glowing in the corner. Dylan frowned. But I didn't say a word. The day Richard was discharged from the hospital, The sunlight was almost cruel in its brightness. As the nurse wheeled him out to the hospital's front entrance, he smiled and said, "Feels good to be home." I smiled too, but it was a smile that stopped at the surface, never reaching my eyes. Home no longer felt like a word I could trust. That house, even after 20 years, felt like a space on loan. The air itself seemed to belong to someone else. I parked at the bottom of the driveway and helped him into the car. He immediately grumbled that the seat was too firm. I said nothing, just pulled the seatbelt a little tighter. As we pulled out of the hospital lot, I glanced at him through the rearview mirror. His eyes were closed, head tilted back like some aging monarch waiting to be served. When we got home, I did what I always did. Poured him a glass of water, turned down the bed, tucked in his favorite olive green blanket. He settled onto the sofa, switched on the TV, and asked me to find his Alaskan hunter photo book. His routine resumed without a blip. No guilt, no pause, as if that conversation in the hospital hallway had never happened. But I knew better. Everything had changed. A few days later, I started going through his hospital bills. That afternoon, I sat in the study, flipping through the deep gray filing cabinet. Insurance forms, payment receipts, medical notices. I had a dab of balm on my dry knuckles as I leafed through the pages, one by one. He had a meticulous system. Blue folders for medical, red for bank statements, yellow for private insurance. Then a single sheet slipped out of the yellow folder and landed face down on the carpet. I bent to pick it up without thinking, but the moment I saw the beneficiary list printed on it, it felt like a dull blade had carved across my chest. Primary beneficiary 1. Dylan Moore. Primary beneficiary 2. Emily Moore, ex-wife. My name wasn't there. Not even as a secondary. I stared at the paper. My fingertips began to tremble. It wasn't about the money. I had never once expected Richard to leave me some grand inheritance. But I thought, after 20 years together, at the end of it all, at least my name would be there. Even just as a gesture. A line on a page that said, "You mattered." But now I understood. I wasn't in his future. Not even in his afterlife. I had stayed up nights doing his taxes. Sat by his side during a gastric bleed. Wrote his retirement speech. All of it suddenly felt like a cruel joke. Yet everything mapped out. Every paper signed, every detail filed. Except one thing. Me. The woman who had become nothing more than a temporary travel companion. I slipped the document back into the folder, not making a sound. That night we had lasagna. He took a bite and immediately frowned. "Something's off," he muttered. "Doesn't taste the same." I replied flatly, "I didn't use mozzarella." He scowled. "Didn't I say I don't want it without cheese?" I stayed quiet. He glanced at me, then mumbled, "You've been acting off lately." I looked up, my voice calm as still water. Maybe I've just seen things more clearly lately." He paused for a few seconds as if waiting for me to explain. I didn't. After dinner, he did what he always did, reclined on the couch, eyes closed, claiming to rest his nerves. I sat across from him in a chair, holding a book I never opened. My mind kept circling back to a single question. How do you keep caring for someone who has systematically written you out of their will, their plans, their trust? For 20 years, I had thought I was part of a contract called marriage. But now I saw it for what it was. An unpaid job. I'd been hired with affection as currency, compassion as compensation, and silence as my severance package. This wasn't love. It was exploitation. Painstaking, polite, and deeply personal. And I had signed up for it. Willingly. Till now. I closed the book, stood up quietly, and walked into the kitchen. I washed the dishes one by one. After I dried my hands, I rested them on the counter and shut my eyes. And there was a voice in my head, calm and certain. It's time. It's time to decide. 2 days later, I finally found the courage to dial the number. The phone rang 3 times before Nancy's voice came floating through like a warm spring breeze. "Hey honey, is that you?" I was just out back spraying the lilacs. Almost didn't hear it ring. My throat tightened. It took a moment before I could speak. "Do you have time to talk?" She heard it instantly, something in my voice. Her tone shifted, calm but firm. "Where are you? Come here. You don't have to explain. I'm waiting." I hung up, grabbed my keys, and left without hesitation. 30 minutes later, I was standing outside her flower shop. She'd named it herself, Bloom on Purpose. A wind chime jingled softly above the door, next to a chalkboard that read, "Today's flower language. You don't owe anyone anything." The moment I stepped in, Nancy wrapped her arms around me. Something in me nearly buckled. I almost couldn't hold it together. She led me out back to the garden patio and poured me a glass of lemon mint tea. I didn't touch it. Just sat there staring at the rose pruning shears on her table before blurting out, "I feel like I've been sliced open for years and I never even noticed." She didn't speak. Just listened. I took a deep breath and told her everything. What I'd overheard in the hospital hallway, the life insurance documents, Dylan's smug indifference, Richard's silence. At one point my voice dropped to almost nothing. "I thought he was just a little old-fashioned," I whispered. "I didn't realize he never saw me as family." Nancy finally spoke, her voice steady and sharp. "He didn't see you as family, Rachel, because he never saw you as a person. He saw you as labor." I looked at her at a loss for words. "Rachel, you're not his wife. You're an unpaid home aide. Full-time." She paused, her gaze unwavering, as grounded and unflinching as the dwarf tree in her courtyard that bloomed year-round. "You need to wake up." "I'm 60, I murmured. "I don't know where to go or what I'd even do now." She cut me off without hesitation. "Go to your daughter. Or stay here in the upstairs room above the shop. The last tenant just moved out. Honestly, I'd love to have you there." I gave a faint, bitter laugh. "I've never been good at change, Nancy. I'm not sure I can." "Listen to me," she leaned in. "You know how I got out of my marriage? My ex ran off with his secretary. I was 29, had a toddler on my hip, a mountain of debt, and a whole family telling me to suck it up. You know what I told them?" I shook my head. She looked me dead in the eye. I said, "I'd rather eat instant noodles for the rest of my life than keep pretending a worthless man is worth my dignity." I laughed. For the first time in 2 weeks I really laughed. She patted my hand. "You're not weak, Rachel. You're just too kind. Kind enough to lock yourself in a cage someone else built." I lowered my head, my eyes stinging. I took a deep breath and felt, finally, a crack in the heavy weight that had been pressing against my chest for so long. We stayed in her garden for hours that afternoon, talking about everything. Before I left, she said something I'll never forget. "You're not a woman abandoned late in life. You're a woman finally choosing to stop being loyal to the wrong people." When I walked out of her shop, I didn't look back. I knew. The moment you start walking forward, really walking, you don't turn around. By the time I got home, it was already dark. The house felt hollow. The kind of silence that clings to the walls like a second skin. Downstairs, the TV was still on. Some late-night financial show Richard had left running, the host rambling on about the stock market. Takeout containers were strewn across the dining table, one lid left open, limp fries spilling out. In the kitchen sink, this morning's coffee mugs floated in stale water. I stood there in the doorway. Didn't turn on the light. Didn't move. Just looked. Even in the days since he'd come home, he hadn't bothered pretending. "No, thank you. No, how are you holding up?" He had completely normalized my presence, just like he'd normalized the idea that I would always stay. But this time I wasn't going to accept it. That night I sat in the study and pulled out an old photo. It was me and Sandra, my daughter from my first marriage, on her college graduation day. We had our arms linked, both smiling wide. Her hair was windblown and I was holding a bouquet of carnations. I stared at those flowers for a long time. Then I stood up, walked to the closet and began to pack. Not out of rage. Not out of spite. But because I finally understood. I needed to leave the place that had stripped me of my personhood. I needed to talk to Sandra. Talk about the future. Talk about whether, at 60, it was still possible to begin again. The next morning I booked a flight to Boston. The moment I stepped off the plane, there she was, Sandra, waiting at the gate. She was wearing a dark green wool coat, her hair pulled back in a simple twist, and her eyes held a mix of worry and tenderness. The moment I wheeled my suitcase through the arrival's gate, she rushed toward me and wrapped her arms tightly around my shoulders. And that's when it hit me. There was still someone in this world who cared about me. Not because I made dinner or folded laundry or fit neatly into some designated role. Just me. "You don't look well," she said softly, studying my face. "I didn't sleep much," I replied, trying to smile. My voice came out hoarse. She didn't press. Just took my suitcase and led me to the parking lot. We barely spoke during the drive. Sandra pulled up in front of her home, A two-story cottage tucked in a quiet Boston suburb, with a front yard garden she tended herself. There was a snow mat at the doorstep and a small wooden sign that read "Welcome Home." Standing there, my nose suddenly tingled with the sting of tears. "Come in, Mom," she said gently. "I made pumpkin soup." The kitchen was just as I remembered, bright, clean, and welcoming. The table was already set with a basket of sliced whole grain bread. I sat down and she brought over the steaming soup, taking the seat across from me. Then with a calm and open voice she said, "Tell me, what's going on?" I lowered my head to blow on the soup, but tears slipped into the bowl before I could take a single sip. I've never been someone who cries easily, but in that moment I realized just how tired I was. Tired of not being allowed to be a fragile mother. I told her everything. Everything that had happened inside that suffocating house. She listened in silence. Now and then her brows tightened, like she was holding back a fury that threatened to spill. When I finally finished, she set her spoon down and spoke with a calm that carried steel beneath it. "He violated your dignity. He violated your right to live freely." I gave a faint, bitter smile. "But I let him. For 20 years. She looked up and her expression softened. "Mom, you did what you thought was right. That's not weakness. That's love. But now it's time to make choices for yourself." I whispered, "Do you think I can still start over? I'm 60. She was quiet for a moment, then smiled, confident, steady. "Of course you can. You have experience, wisdom, savings, and people who love you. Most importantly, you're still here. You're alive." I didn't speak. I just nodded slowly. "We need to review his financial assets and what qualifies as marital property," Sandra said. "I'll help you find a lawyer I trust. You don't need to wage some massive revenge campaign. But you do need to take back what's rightfully yours." "I don't even know where to begin," I admitted. "You begin," she said, rising to her feet, walking over and resting a hand gently on my shoulder. "By knowing you don't have to keep enduring this. You've already taken the hardest step. The rest? Now it has direction." That night I stayed in her guest room. Outside the window, an old oak tree stretched its limbs beneath the moonlight like a watchful guardian. I lay in bed, flipping through an old notebook I had stuffed in my bag. The first page read, "Year 3 of marriage." Richard built a bench in the backyard. We sat together watching the leaves fall, sipping hot chocolate. I stared at the line, then carefully tore the page out. Not out of hatred, but because I finally understood. Not every shared memory deserves to be kept. The next day back home, I didn't sort Richard's pill organizer like I usually did. Instead, I opened my laptop in silence and typed in a phrase I'd never searched before. "Remarried women asset protection." The words looked foreign and almost abrasive on the screen. But I knew I had to start learning. I spent the entire day reading through 3 different law firms' websites, combing through more than a dozen case studies about divorce and asset division later in life. Turns out, I wasn't the only woman who had woken up at 60. I wasn't the only one who had realized she'd been living in an economically controlled relationship. That afternoon, I submitted a request for legal consultation. A local women-run law firm responded with a preliminary phone intake, scheduled for 3 days later. At the same time, I started looking for a job. Something of my own, something that would allow me to support myself after the divorce. I had experience with editing and clerical work, so I picked up a part-time remote position with a content platform. It wasn't easy, but the small paycheck I earned, money that was mine and mine alone, brought a kind of freedom I hadn't felt in years. Most days I spent hours alone in the study, flipping through old photo albums and paper journals. One day I found a photo from a work trip to San Francisco over a decade ago. I was wearing a navy knit sweater standing in front of the Golden Gate Bridge. There was light in my eyes and a quiet smile on my lips. Back then I loved photography. I baked. I went to the museum every week. I even wrote a short paper on women's oral histories. It was never published, but I was proud of it for a long time. I stared at that photo for a while, holding it in my hands, remembering the version of me who used to love life so fully. And then Richard opened the door. "Dylan says he's coming over for dinner," he announced. I blinked. "Didn't he just come by a few days ago?" "So what?" Richard said, his voice laced with entitlement. "It's not like you have anything else going on. Just make a few extra dishes. He's bringing his girlfriend too." I didn't argue. I turned and walked into the kitchen. But this time I didn't waste my time or energy trying to make anything special. I grabbed a few frozen meals from the freezer and tossed together 2 canned salads. No effort. No explanation. Anyone I was preparing to walk away from didn't deserve another egg cracked in their honor. Let them eat or don't. When they arrived, I was already seated at the dining table, editing a manuscript I hadn't finished yet. Dylan's voice was the first to break the silence. God, this place smells like a nursing home. How do you even stand it, Dad? His girlfriend snorted. You told me Rachel was some kind of housekeeper-chef combo. This is worse than takeout. I didn't look up. I just turned another page. Dylan walked into the kitchen, opened the fridge, poked around, then came back and knocked on the table. This is it for dinner? You do know my dad has high blood pressure, right? I finally looked at him. My voice was steady. If you don't like it, you're free to eat elsewhere. Richard frowned, trying to smooth things over. He didn't mean it like that, Rachel. You don't have to get this way. I set my papers down and looked him square in the eye. So stress is an excuse to be rude now? Dylan let out a short laugh and turned to his girlfriend. See what I mean? With that attitude, it's no wonder my dad didn't list her as a life insurance beneficiary. You know they've been married 20 years and she doesn't get a dime. No way, the girl said, feigning shock. Then what's she in it for? Dylan shrugged. I don't know. A sense of accomplishment from playing nursemaid to an old man. I stood up slowly, my voice cold and hard as steel. What I was in it for was the fact that back then, I didn't see clearly enough to realize your dad is a coward in a gentleman's costume. The room fell silent. I turned to Richard. What I did for you all these years wasn't out of weakness. It was because I believed you were worth it. I was wrong. Then I looked at Dylan, my words gaining speed and weight. And I don't need you to remind me I'm not your mother. I never wanted to be. But I am more of a human being than you'll ever be, because I understand things like respect, gratitude, and basic decency. I scanned the table once, then said loud and clear, this is the last meal you'll ever eat in this house that came from my hands. Starting tonight, we're separating. I'm filing for divorce. My lawyer is already in place. Richard's face went pale, then flushed. He stood abruptly. Rachel, you can't just. I absolutely can. I cut him off, my voice razor-sharp but calm. And let me tell you something, this isn't some emotional outburst. It's a decision. The clearest one I've ever made in 60 years. I turned, walked into the bedroom and closed the door behind me, opened the drawer, took out the confirmation letter from the law firm, and gently taped it to the back of the door. That moment wasn't just about walking away from them. It was about walking back to myself. The morning I left that house, the street was eerily quiet. I packed light, 2 suitcases, a file folder, and a small bag of medications. Nancy showed up right on time and didn't ask any questions. She just picked up a bag of books from the doorway and gave me a small, knowing nod. Richard stood in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, leaning against the frame. His face wore a look that hovered somewhere between mockery and disbelief. He didn't say a word, but his eyes said everything. Go on. Prove it. He probably thought I was bluffing, just venting that I'd turn around after a dramatic moment or two. He didn't even bother trying to stop me. But I knew that silence of his for exactly what it was. His oldest tactic. Oppression through indifference. Control through disdain. He thought silence made him powerful. This time he miscalculated. I didn't say much. Just one line before I closed the door. If you want someone to cook for you next time, try offering a salary. The door shut with a soft, final sound. No tears. No nostalgia. Just calm. Nancy's upstairs apartment was small, barely 400 square feet. But it was warm, clean, and entirely mine. It had its own kitchenette, a west-facing window, and just outside her garden was in full bloom. The tulips had exploded into color as if to welcome me. I sat on the edge of the bed watching sunlight spill across the hardwood floor, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something that resembled peace. No one needed me. No one ordered me around. No one diminished me. There was only me. That night I cooked for myself for the first time in years. Roasted butternut squash, a salad with goat cheese and walnuts, and a glass of chilled Riesling. The stovetop crackled, floral breeze drifted in through the window, and I sat alone at a little table, listening to a vintage jazz record Nancy had gifted me, singing softly under my breath as I ate. After dinner I opened my laptop and logged into my editing platform. The editor had left me a note in the system. Your markup was incredibly precise. If you're interested, we'd love to offer you more consistent assignments. I smiled. Not the polite kind. The real kind. The kind that comes from gratitude, for myself. For the choice I made to leave. I expected Richard to erupt within a few days. He didn't. Just 2 text messages. How long are you planning to drag this out? You really think you won't regret this? I didn't respond. Nancy told me, don't look back. If he really felt remorse, he'd know how to apologize without being prompted. Dylan never showed up again. Maybe he thought with me gone the house felt more free. But I knew it wouldn't take long before the 2 of them realized what they'd really lost. Not just the woman who had kept the house running, but the last shred of dignity their lives had been hiding behind. I slowly started building a new rhythm in my new community. Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays I worked part-time. Weekends I helped Nancy at the flower shop. And in the remaining hours, I enrolled in writing classes at the local community college, learning how to give my story a voice with strength. I even started a blog for older women called Rebirth. The first post was titled, Leaving the House with No Name on the Mailbox. Post-separation life didn't immediately become glamorous or easy. No fairy tale endings, no sudden bursts of joy. But I stopped waiting for someone else to decide if I deserved to be treated well. It was a gray morning when I met with the lawyer. Sandra had taken the day off to drive me to her trusted firm, Willow and Hartman, a small practice specializing in divorce and financial protection for older women. The office was tucked above a second-hand bookstore. As we stepped inside, the air was laced with the scent of old paper and freshly brewed coffee. Our attorney, Karen Yates, was in her 50s, dressed in a tailored charcoal blazer. She flipped through our documents, marriage certificate, property records, bank statements. With brisk precision, her tone steady, her gaze focused. She asked me a rapid series of questions. Efficient, thorough, but never cold. You were married in 2005? I nodded. And the house was already under his name at the time? Yes. But during the marriage you weren't earning an income, and you served as Richard's primary caregiver while he was ill? I answered softly, yes. She jotted a few notes, then looked up at me. Rachel, you're entitled to more than you think. I blinked, surprised. Karen explained, under California law, you have the right to claim a fair portion of marital assets, including growth in retirement accounts during the marriage, shared income gains, and reasonable spousal support. Remember, this isn't begging. This is exercising your legal rights. I looked at Sandra. She gave a small nod and gently squeezed my hand. And in that moment, something long buried, silenced by shame and compliance, began to stir inside me. I deserve this. Karen moved quickly. She filed a temporary protective order to freeze certain account activities and submitted an official declaration of separation. Within a week, Richard found out. That afternoon, I had just returned from Nancy's flower shop when my phone rang. Richard. I hesitated, then answered. Rachel, he began, his voice low, but the old confidence was gone, replaced by something brittle. You really plan to drag decades of marriage into court over something this petty? I stayed silent. He continued, all you're doing is turning a family matter into a mess. You think someone like Karen, some second-tier lawyer, can actually win you anything? I exhaled slowly. My voice was even. She doesn't have to win it. She just has to get what's already mine. There was silence. I didn't wait for his next move. I hung up. A few days later, Dylan showed up. He was standing outside the flower shop, red-faced with rage. You trying to bankrupt us? He snapped. I looked him straight in the eye. I didn't say a word. Is Sandra paying for your lawyer? How long do you think she'll keep carrying your dead weight? You're a parasite, Rachel. You always have been. You were never one of us. Before I could respond, Nancy came out and stepped in front of me. Her voice was soft but cutting. You say one more word and I'm calling the police. Dylan backed off a little, seething. You'll regret this. You think you're getting anything? You're not. And then he stormed off. I didn't follow him. Didn't argue. I just filed away every word. Years of silence had only earned me deeper contempt. So now I was learning how to speak. Karen immediately began the process of requesting a full financial disclosure. 10 years of Richard's asset history. I knew it would drive him crazy. Because to a man like Richard, money is identity. Exposure is humiliation. And now, piece by piece, I was peeling off the mask he had worn for decades. Not out of revenge, but to show him one simple truth. I am not the woman you get to use for free. The morning of the court ruling, I wore a navy trench coat, no makeup, no earrings. Sandra walked beside me into the courthouse, dressed in a sharp lawyer's suit, one hand clutching her case file, the other gently holding mine. Her stride was confident, her expression resolute. I followed her through the building's cold hallways, and suddenly, I remembered walking her to school all those years ago, when I was the one protecting her. And now here she was, using her knowledge and courage to stand beside me. I wasn't being led anymore. I had someone in my corner. The trial didn't last long. Karen had prepared everything with airtight precision. Richard tried to delay, but he had nothing. No evidence to support any claim that I wasn't entitled to a share of our marital assets. In fact, during financial disclosure, it came to light that he had quietly transferred funds into Dylan's name the previous year. The judge flagged it immediately, an attempt to circumvent equitable distribution. When the ruling was read aloud, it was like the courtroom dropped into silence, as if my ears had been placed under glass. All I heard, clear as a knife slicing through paper, was one word. Grant. I had won. I was awarded 1/3 of our marital assets in cash compensation, including funds from our joint accounts and a portion of investment returns. The court also ordered Richard to pay spousal support, $2,500 per month for 2 years. I felt no triumph. No revenge. Just a quiet exhale. This wasn't a windfall. It was repayment. Repayment for 2 decades of unpaid labor, emotional erosion, and the slow, grinding erosion of self. I thought that judgment would be the end. A clean cut. A final page. But 2 weeks later, a registered letter arrived from the hospital. It stated that Richard had been rushed into emergency care following a hypertensive crisis and cerebral hypoperfusion. He'd been moved to the ICU. There were no family members on file. No one had signed the long-term care authorization. I sat at the kitchen table with the letter in my hand, completely still. He'd looked fine in court, holding himself like a man still in control. But that verdict must have cracked the last mask he had. Because for men like Richard, money, control, and image aren't just tools. They are blood and oxygen. I didn't call. I didn't write. Instead, I called Karen and asked her to transfer all care-related legal permissions to Dylan. She followed up the next day. It's done. But Dylan isn't being cooperative. I wasn't surprised. Dylan, like his father, was a purebred opportunist. The moment he learned half the assets were gone, he probably decided Richard had outlived his usefulness. But none of it had anything to do with me anymore. A few days later, while Nancy was trimming roses, she said, I heard Dylan posted something online, something like, dragging around medical debt and refusing to die is a waste of resources. At least a quick death gets you insurance money. I nodded. I didn't respond. And in that moment I finally understood. Richard's greatest fear had never been illness. It was never money. It was the idea that no one would choose to suffer on his behalf anymore. He got what he wanted. He gave everything to Dylan. And Dylan? He's just waiting for a death certificate. Richard never imagined it would end like this. And I never imagined that, standing at the edge of his life, I'd feel absolutely nothing. No pity. No grief. Only the unshakable clarity that walking away was the most dignified thing I ever did. Early summer sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains on the second floor of the flower shop, casting a warm, slanted glow across the room. I sat at the old wooden desk by the window, a thick notebook propped beneath my keyboard. On the screen, the title of my blog post stared back at me. From being needed to being seen. It had taken me 3 full days to write. Not because it was difficult, but because with every paragraph I discovered just how much I had to say. For the first time I could tell my story in my own voice. No longer through someone else's lens. No more dancing around the pain. I'm now a registered freelance editor. Each month I contribute to 2 lifestyle platforms and manage a small subscription column of my own. The readership is modest but genuine. They leave comments like, "Your words feel like warm water, gentle but never weak. Thank you for the courage. It helps me find mine." That day, Sandra flew in from Boston to visit me. She got off the shuttle waving a small paper bag. "I brought your favorite brownies," she said with a grin. I took it with a laugh and noticed a little sticker on the outside. She'd printed it herself. "Congratulations, Mom, on being reborn." The first thing she did when we stepped into the apartment was take a good look around. "Mom, you really made this place yours." "Of course," I said, pointing to a new wooden plaque on the wall. Carved into it were the words, "Rachel's Space, quiet, curious, free." Nancy had helped me pick it out. She said it captured exactly who I am now. We sat in the kitchen drinking tea and catching up. Then out of nowhere Sandra asked, "Have you heard anything about Dylan lately?" I shook my head. "No. And honestly, I'm not interested." She nodded, not pressing further. We both knew, if I still cared about what was happening on that side of life, I hadn't truly left it behind. But I had. I could say it now fully and freely. Whatever collapses in their world is no longer my concern. After dinner, she pulled out a collection of case studies from her office. Stories about financial independence in older women. I flipped through a few pages and found one section underlined in bright blue. At any age, the decision to stop being agreeable is an act of bravery. But true victory is becoming your full self, without needing anyone's permission. I folded the corner of that page and looked up. "Do you remember when you were little and you asked me what kind of person I wanted to be?" Sandra smiled. "You said, someone who's trusted, but never taken for granted." I nodded. "And now I finally understand. To be respected and trusted by others, I have to trust myself first." We spent the rest of the afternoon helping Nancy arrange the new batch of roses in her backyard. I picked the center slot on the flower stand and wrote the name of the variety on a blank wooden tag. Sandra glanced at it and laughed. "Gratitude rose? Really?" I smiled. "Absolutely. That's how I feel. It's a late bloomer, but it's steady." As twilight settled in, the string lights above the shop door flickered to life, one by one. I stood at the threshold, watching the alley fill with soft laughter, the gentle clink of wind chimes and the glow of distant headlights. And I realized, I was standing at the doorway to an entirely new life. No longer defined by anyone else's family or needs. No longer the invisible woman in the second act of her life. Just me. And for the first time in a long time, that was more than enough.